In 1950, at the height of the Korean War, the entire logistics system of the United States faced the threat of collapse. Widespread coal strikes were sweeping the nation. Expensive steam and diesel trains were completely paralyzed. The U.S. military was desperately searching for a way to maintain the vital railway lines across the majestic Rocky Mountains to transport weapons and supplies to the anti-communist front. But would you believe it? The sole savior, the colossal machine shouldering the life-or-death mission of America in that critical hour, bore the name of the opposition's leader, Joseph Stalin. Exactly. American railroad workers gave it an incredibly ironic nickname, Little Joe. How did a machine born to serve the Soviet Empire end up stranded in the heart of America and, ironically, shoulder the burden of the capitalist war machine against the communist bloc itself? Welcome to one of the most paradoxical and deeply buried historical cases of the 20th century. History does not solely reside in glamorous treaties or the vows of politicians on podiums. Sometimes, the naked truth of an era is hidden beneath the layers of grease and rust of a machine weighing over 270 tons, harboring a reality that could shatter all your preconceptions. Let's turn back the clock to the General Electric (GE) plant in Erie, Pennsylvania in 1946. Very few people know that right before the Iron Curtain fell to permanently divide the world in half, American engineers at GE and top-tier Soviet specialists shared a historic handshake. Together, they designed a true technological masterpiece, the most powerful electric locomotives in the world at that time. They possessed a massive 2D plus D-2 wheel arrangement to neutralize the extreme weight, and were specifically engineered to withstand the 3,300-volt electrical system of the Soviet railway network. But by 1948, just as the fleet was rolling out for testing, the Cold War struck. The U.S. State Department immediately issued an embargo. In the eyes of military officials at the time, locomotives were not merely civilian transport vehicles. They were strictly classified as strategic goods and weapons, capable of altering the tide of a battlefield. This ban pushed GE into a tragically absurd situation. Stuck with 20 steel monsters, custom-built for the stubborn 5-foot Russian broad gauge, which no one else in the world needed, and totally useless on almost all standard American railways. But this story does not end with a collapsed business deal due to geopolitical conflicts. If it were just that, Little Joe would have rested in peace in a scrapyard. In this video, I will take you far beyond that surface layer. We will not only decode how the enemy's machine slipped through a narrow crack to become America's undisputed workhorse, but also expose the most ruthless economic murder in transportation history. Through the story of Little Joe, you will discover an invaluable real-world lesson in business and management. That no matter how superior and durable a technology is, it can be choked to death by the ignorance and short-sighted greed of top executives. Why did the board of directors of the Milwaukee Road Railway decide to personally butcher their perfectly functional electrified network right in the middle of a global oil crisis, the OPEC embargo, just to strip the copper wire and sell it as scrap? Fasten your seatbelts. This train, named Historical Paradox, is about to depart, and the truth at the final station will undoubtedly force you to rethink how this world operates. Imagine you are the sales director of General Electric in 1948. You are standing, looking out over a vast lot in Erie, Pennsylvania, where 20 colossal steel blocks, each nearly 27 meters long and weighing hundreds of tons, lie gathering dust under the snow. They are engineering marvels, but now they have become the most expensive liabilities in America due to a political embargo. What do? You sell them off at a fire sale. GE frantically knocked on the door of every railroad company that utilized electrified lines. And then the Milwaukee Road, a giant boasting a transcontinental railroad with electrified segments draped across the majestic Rockies, appeared. And this is where the short-sightedness of the capitalists began to reveal itself. GE was so desperate that they offered the entire batch of 20 masterpieces, along with all spare parts, for a mere $1 million. To put that in perspective, this figure was only slightly above their scrap value. It was absurdly cheap for brand new machines that were the most powerful in the world. This should have been the bargain of the century, a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for the Milwaukee Road to dominate the transportation industry. Yet, the company's board of directors, with minds fixated solely on short-term risks, hesitated and refused to release the funds. It wasn't until they were pushed to the wall that they woke up. In 1950, the outbreak of the Korean War caused a sudden surge in freight demand. Simultaneously, a massive coal strike broke out, forcing steam and diesel locomotives to be sidelined due to a lack of fuel. The Milwaukee Road fell into sheer panic. They crawled back to GE and bought the final 12 Little Joes, after the other 8 had been quickly snapped up by a company in Chicago and exported to Brazil. When these machines officially rolled onto American tracks, an irony of historical proportions took shape. Look deep into the geopolitical picture of the time. These machines, carrying engineering hearts designed by Russians and based on the strict technical requirements of the Soviet Union, were now painted with American logos. Even more ironically, they plowed through day and night, braving the biting cold of the Rocky Mountains to transport goods and raw materials for the very war machine of the U.S. military aimed at fighting against the communist bloc. History always knows how to craft the sharpest satirical plays, where yesterday's enemy becomes today's reluctant savior. American mechanics initially stepped into the cabins of the Little Joes with extreme skepticism. How could they drive a machine where the entire control panel, buttons, and pressure gauges were labeled in Russian? But they soon realized that the language of peak engineering is universal. After translating the control panels and tweaking a few parameters, they discovered they were riding a true monster. However, that monster was held back not by itself, but by the very people who bought it. In the engineering world, people often blame the machine when it fails to reach peak performance. But the technical records of the Little Joes point to a different truth. The fault was not with the machine, but with the infrastructure. The Milwaukee Road's substation system was incredibly obsolete, built during World War I. They were so weak that if 2 Little Joes pulled at full throttle on the same stretch of track, the entire electrical grid would collapse. These Soviet technological giants were essentially in chains, forced to operate below their true capacity simply because of the impoverished infrastructure of an American corporation. Despite their constrained power, the Little Joes still proved their superior class. Thanks to the design of 16 massive driving wheels intended to reduce the initial axle load, originally meant for Russian rails, they possessed excellent traction on slippery, steep mountain passes. The Milwaukee Road cleverly modified 2 units, E20 and E21, by gutting the interior of one cab end, since the original Russian design featured dual cabs to eliminate the need for turning the locomotive around, to install a steam heating generator, transforming them into perfect passenger haulers. For decades, the Little Joes operated tirelessly, smoothly, and more efficiently than any expensive diesel locomotive of their era. They became a proud symbol for the mechanics who directly operated them. Yet, engineering excellence is never a sturdy enough shield against the stupidity of greed. The Little Joes had survived the Cold War embargo and risen above the initial alienation of American engineers, but they were about to face a far more vicious enemy: soulless financial reports and the insane decisions of upper management in air-conditioned boardrooms. A shocking industrial murder was about to be staged. It is often believed that, in the evolution of industry, an old technology is phased out simply because it has become obsolete, giving way to superior inventions. But one of the biggest lies of the 20th century American transportation industry is this: electric locomotives disappeared because they could not compete with the flexibility of diesel engines. The proof lies right in the files of the Little Joe, exposing a perfect fallacy created to cover up a campaign of economic suicide by the elite. Entering the 1970s, the Little Joes were still the uncrowned kings of the Rockies. Despite having to operate under a dilapidated electrical infrastructure dating back to World War I, their durability was indisputable. But in the big cities, inside oak-paneled boardrooms, the executives of the Milwaukee Road weren't looking at tractive effort or durability. They were only looking at the numbers on the balance sheet. In early 1973, ignoring their strategic trump card, the board of directors of the Milwaukee Road made a decision that could rank among the most classic management blunders of all time. They ordered the complete dismantling of the electrified network. Then, history delivered its cruelest punchline. By late 1973, the world was shaken by the oil crisis, OPEC embargo. Oil prices skyrocketed unprecedentedly, causing utter panic for all vehicles reliant on fossil fuels. Logically, this should have been the golden moment for the electrified railway system to shine, utilizing dirt-cheap domestic coal or abundant hydroelectricity. Instead, the Milwaukee Road was already locked into destroying their greatest competitive advantage, right as their competitors were hemorrhaging cash to pay massive diesel bills. Why such an insane decision? The real reason did not lie in maintenance costs or the performance of the Little Joes. It lay in the thousands of miles of copper wiring hanging suspended in the air. These executives, with a vision that extended no further than the next quarter's financial report, saw a massive cash windfall. They believed that by tearing down this entire electrical cable system and selling it as copper scrap, the company would instantly rake in a massive profit. And so, this campaign of corporate suicide began. The Milwaukee Road dispatched crews of workers along the routes, disabling substations and severing the lifeblood of the Little Joe machines. But history once again dealt a lethal blow to the greedy and short-sighted. The process of dismantling the electrical cable system was so complex and costly that the amount they had to pay for labor and machinery was far higher than initially estimated. Even worse, and more ironically, at the exact moment they brought massive piles of copper wire to the market to cash in, global copper prices suddenly took a disastrous plunge. Ultimately, instead of pocketing millions of dollars, the Milwaukee Road actually had to pay out of pocket, taking on a massive debt just to single-handedly strangle their own greatest competitive advantage amidst an oil price storm. In mid-1974, when the last electric train rolled by, the Milwaukee Road had euthanized a glorious era. Without a power source, the colossal Little Joes were forced into retirement, having to rely entirely on expensive diesel locomotives on treacherous, steep mountain passes eroded the Milwaukee Road's finances, pushing the massive corporation down a slippery slope into bankruptcy shortly thereafter. If you still harbor any lingering doubts that the end of the Little Joes was because electric technology itself was unsuitable, then this investigative file will lead you to two living witnesses across borders. In Chicago, the South Shore Line Railroad also purchased 3 Little Joes from that same embargoed batch, which they called the 800 series. With a more sober and pragmatic management mindset, They fully exploited the power of these machines. These three tin soldiers with Soviet blood plowed on relentlessly, becoming the very last electric freight locomotives to serve on America's mainline railroad system, surviving and operating durably all the way until 1983. And what about Brazil? 5 Little Joes were sold down to South America and were affectionately called Russas, Russians, by the locals. While American experts at the Milwaukee Road disparaged their electrical network and destroyed their own system, in Brazil, the Russas were revered as gods of power. They instantly became the most powerful locomotives in the country. The most ironclad proof of the Little Joe's greatness is this. These machines, rejected by America, tirelessly hauled heavy freight trains through the Brazilian forests all the way until 1999. The stark contrast between their longevity in South America and Chicago and their wrongful death in Milwaukee closes this investigative file. The life of the Little Joe is not just a story about blocks of steel, but a magnifying glass shining a light on the fragility of great engineering legacies when they fall into the hands of those who only know how to count money. When the electrical grid was torn down, the death sentence for the Milwaukee Road's Little Joes was officially pronounced. The machines that once proudly roared across the snow-capped Rocky Mountains, bearing technology ahead of their time, were now dragged to the scrapyard. The screech of metal-cutting saws tore through the thick steel shells originally designed to withstand the harsh Russian winters. A bitterly resentful end for America's saviors. But in history, great legacies are rarely wiped out completely. There are always those sober enough to recognize their value before the welding torch severs the last piece of metal. The ultimate irony lies in how corporations treat their own legacies. The Milwaukee Road, the giant that once owned up to 12 Little Joes, coldly butchered almost its entire fleet to recoup a pittance in scrap metal money. They spared only a single unit, the E-70. Today, this machine sits silently on display on the courthouse lawn in Deer Lodge, Montana, wearing the signature orange and black livery of the Milwaukee. But to those who know the story, the E-70 does not look like a glorious monument. It looks more like a tombstone, engraving the short-sightedness of capitalists. Kindness and respect, ironically, came from the smaller companies. Look at the South Shore Line. They had a mere 3 Little Joes, yet they decided to preserve 2 of them. This is not just an astonishing preservation ratio, it is a genuine miracle in the world of railway preservation. Unit 803 currently resides at the Illinois Railway Museum, and the shocking thing is, it is still operational. In the preservation world, keeping a steam or diesel locomotive running is hard enough, but maintaining a high-voltage electrical grid so that a colossal Cold War-era electric locomotive can roll is a transcendent feat rarely seen globally. Its brother, Unit 802, is also resting proudly at a museum in Pennsylvania. On the other side of the hemisphere, Brazil also proved they cherished these machines far more than their American owners. 2 Russas, numbers 6,452 and 6,455, were saved from the ravages of time. Despite being left outdoors and stripped of parts, they were eventually moved to museums in Sao Paulo, forever protected as great witnesses of the South American railway industry. Closing the file on the Little Joe, what do we see? The story of the machine bearing the Soviet leader's name is not just a bizarre anecdote about a collapsed strategic arms deal during the Cold War. It is a practical lesson, a harsh wake-up call sent to modern business and management. We live in an era where technological decisions are often dictated by short-term financial pressures. Too many companies today are willing to throw away core values and sustainable competitive advantages just to dress up their quarterly earnings reports. The Little Joe is the most vivid proof that decline does not always come from technology becoming obsolete. Sometimes, Decline is purposefully manufactured by human greed. The Milwaukee Road was wiped off the map shortly after they euthanized their own electrical grid. A heavy but entirely well-deserved price for their stupidity. Meanwhile, the machines they abandoned survived in other countries, rising to become legends. History is always fair in its own way. The dust of time may obscure rusted train cars, but the truth always shines bright. The next time you see a company abandon a great project simply for the sake of cutting costs, remember the little Joes. Remember the thousands of miles of copper cable dismantled right as oil prices hit their peak. Thank you for joining me on this journey back through the hidden corners of history. The truth is sometimes brutal, but it always needs to be told. See you in the next investigative files, where other glamorous lies will continue to be unmasked.